All right, hello, lovely lovelies. So, you take a few minutes and think about this warm up. In our last video was about the different cells, tissues, and organs. It was really 2 videos of plants. And then today we're going to talk about plant reproduction. And so I've included this picture here. So this is some lizards, and it talks about their reproduction. They're really interesting. If you are at all interested, you should look them up because they're all female. But they reproduce, and they're vertebrates, which and terrestrial. They live on land. There are some other organisms that have some similarities to this, but they are less developed organisms than these. So it's kind of an interesting story. All right, so the 3 main tissue types and their functions. So if we work from the outside in, our 3 tissue types are, so we have dermal, oh, Lord have mercy. Okay, and dermal tissue is for protection, and it goes along the outside of the plant, and it has a few functions. It secretes the cuticle. Oh, y'all. Come on now. Let's see if I can get this going again. So it functions in protection because it secretes that cuticle, and also just as a physical barrier, just like our skin is. And then the next one, like I said, kind of working from the outside in. Sorry, I'm using a different pen today, and it is not functioning as the way that I'm used to. Maybe I'll get used to it. Working from the outside in, inside the dermal directly is ground tissue. And ground tissue is going to be used for storage of all kinds of things, including lipids and carbs. We'll just make it like that. And then the last type is vascular tissue. Now, obviously, if it's a non-vascular plant, it doesn't have vascular tissue. But if it is a vascular plant, it does. Oh, my stars. I'm sorry, y'all. So vascular tissue is going to be composed, or is made up, is what makes up xylem and phloem, and these are for transport. So that's their functions. So those are the 3 main tissue types and their functions. Oh, this is going to be a long day with this pen. In this video, we're going to talk about plant reproduction, and the biggest focus is going to be on these guys, these flowering plants. However, we will talk a little bit about non-flowering plants, and there's lots of interesting stuff. I've learned stuff this time that I didn't really catch in the past, and and I feel like that happens every year. So anyway, here we go. So let's start with the ways that plants can reproduce. Plants are reproductively sexual organisms. So they have male and female parts, and they reproduce sexually. However, there are some plants that, in addition to reproducing sexually, can have an asexual reproduction as well. And so depending on the conditions, they'll be able to alternate between sexual and asexual reproduction. And I hope you guys remember the advantage to sexual reproduction is because of the processes that happen during meiosis, more variability. And so depending on the conditions, that variability can be good, but if the plant is thriving, it can be an advantage to be able to asexually reproduce because whatever combination they have is working at the time. So you can see both of those. And we'll talk a little bit about how humans take advantage of the ways that plants reproduce asexually. All right, so again, we're going to start with sexual reproduction and spend most of our time on that. Now, in general, for all plants, we have what's called alteration of generations. So all plants have this two-phase life cycle where they have a phase that produces gametes, and that's called the gametophyte phase. And then the sporophyte, which is the spore-producing phase. Now, I find the easiest way to remember this, because we're going to see when we get to flowering plants especially, this part is, the way these are connected to each other, let me just say it this way, the ways these are connected to each other is different in flowering plants and in gymnosperms as well. And so these aren't as stark. We can't tell them apart nearly as well as we can in the other two groups, the vascular seedless and the non-vascular. So we're going to go through those two. Like I said, they're really complicated, but really cool. So if you're interested in them, look into them even more. All right. So here's kind of the summary of what happens with seedless plants. They have distinctly separate generations, and both of these types, the vascular and non-vascular seedless plants, have swimming sperm, which is something that we don't typically think of in terms of plants. So let's start over here with the non-vascular, because this is the simplest if we were talking about how the evolution. So the key here is that the gametophyte is the dominant phase. So that means that the plant that makes the gametes, remember gametes are going to be sperm and eggs, are the plant that you see, the big structure plant that you see when you see a non-vascular plant. Now, mosses and other non-vascular plants are really small anyway, so really, when I say the big plant that you see, really, I mean, they're pretty small in general. But if we were to kind of get down where we could look at them, this is essentially the structures that we see. What is happening here is all of these, this whole plant, is haploid. Okay? So this whole plant is haploid. So if you remember back to when we were talking about genetics and reproduction, haploid means that it has half of the required genetic information for the diploid organism. Okay? And for humans, and pretty much everything else we're going to talk about after these two guys, the only haploid cells are the reproductive cells. There aren't any structural haploid cells, but in mosses, they are. So this whole plant structure is haploid. So all of the cells have only half of their genetic information. And what happens is those cells in this plant, which are all haploid, and so what we have is on the top of the male plant, we have what's called an antheridium, and that through mitosis, we're going to produce sperm. And then on the top of the female plant, we have what's called the archegonium, and it's going to produce eggs, and they're just going to stay there. And the sperm is going to swim in water. When water goes over the top of these plants, like when it rains, those sperm are going to swim over to the top of this plant, so basically from here to here, and fertilize. And then when fertilization takes place, the sperm is going to travel down to the egg, which is again at the top of this female plant. Okay? Now at this point, all the cells that form from there are diploid, because sperm and egg are going to combine here, and what's going to happen is this structure is going to grow out of the top of the female plant. So this is this. Okay? This is still just the female plant. This is going to grow out, and this is my sporophyte. There are diploid cells in here. Right before, as the spores release, they go through meiosis and produce these spores, and these spores are haploid, and that's what become these plants. So it's really different and really crazy, and I think it's super interesting. I'm going to see that over here as well with the vascular seedless, but it is not the type of plant that humans have a lot of interaction with. So as the usefulness of that information is not very high, like there's just not a lot of reason for you to understand it, other than the fact that it's super cool, which is reason enough for me. All right, now with the vascular seedless plants, dominant structure that we see with these guys is the sporophyte. So this structure that we associate with these guys, a fern, is the mature sporophyte. And it's nice over here, it shows us the N and 2N a little bit more clearly. But to be fair, it's a little bit easier to show on this. So what happens here is we have this sporophyte that is going to, that is 2N. Okay, so it's diploid. It was, it came from the combination of a sperm and an egg. And it's going to make these what are called sori, which are on the underside of fern. If you've ever seen a fern plant and if it has those little things on the underside, those are sori. Sometimes people think that it has a disease or something, but it doesn't. And those hold the spores. And so the spores are going to be produced through meiosis. And so through meiosis, I'm going to get these spores that really should be kind of down there. They're going to go through cell division, and they're going to produce this. Now, this looks like it's about the same size as this adult fern, but it's not. It's really small. It's probably like the size of a clover, and you have a male and female part of this gametophyte. And the male part produces sperm, and the female part produces eggs, and the sperm swim to the eggs, fertilization takes place. We're back to 2N, a diploid structure, and that new sporophyte will grow off of that gametophyte and become this big plant that we're familiar with. So ferns, even though they look more familiar to us, and we're much more accustomed to them probably than mosses, they still have a very different reproductive plan than our flowering plants. The other types of plants that we've talked about are plants that produce seeds, okay? And so let's talk about seeds in general. You may have seen seeds like this sitting around, in stores for you to buy. And what you may or may not have noticed before is while they're sitting dry in those little packages, they don't start to grow. They just sit. It's like they're on pause, okay? And there's not a lot, by the way, of living things that can be completely dried out and then just can come back to life. Can come to life. It's a pretty cool thing, actually. And so that possibility with seeds is the great advantage of seed plants because they allow for this period of dormancy. So essentially, if there are unfavorable environmental conditions, like if it's too cold, if it's too hot, if there's not enough water, if there's not enough carbon dioxide or oxygen, the plant won't start growing. And then it also allows for dispersal so that parent plant can disperse the seeds away from the adult plant. All right, so what happens when that seed starts to grow? So that process of the seed bursting open and becoming the baby plant is called germination. So that's a term you should be familiar with. So it's the growth of an embryo into what's called a seedling. And it's considered a seedling once photosynthesis begins. Okay? So what happens is when water goes into the seed absorbs that water through osmosis, and this essentially hydrates some of the proteins and carbohydrates that are within the seed, and the seed physically will swell, and that gives access to the water to other parts within the seed, and it basically activates the enzymes inside that allow these processes to start working to allow for our seedling. So the first thing that emerges is the radicle. That's this little baby root that comes out, and then eventually the seed leaves, and there's about 2 days worth of energy that the plant or that the seed can work through before it has to start photosynthesis, or it will die. So that's what germination is. All right, so that's the advantages of seeds and what happens to seeds. And so let's talk about the two groups of plants that produce seeds. So those are gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now, this the gametophyte, sporophyte part is these terms are really not used with gymnosperms and angiosperms so readily. There is alteration of generations, but the gametophyte, it's as it says here, it lives out a brief life that is almost entirely within the walls of the sporophyte, which is what we see when we see these plants. We're looking at the sporophyte. And so it really is, like, I'm not going to spend any real time on it. If you're interested, I'll be happy to talk to you more about it, or you can research it if you're, like I said, if you're interested. But essentially, the gametophytes are within the sporophytes. Gymnosperms are the cone-bearing plants. In general, we can say they're wind-pollinated, and they lead to, so we have some cones that are female and some cones that are male. And so pollen is produced by those male cones. Eggs are produced by the female cones. What happens essentially is the pollen goes into these structures which are within the female cone. Fertilization takes place and we end up with a seed. These are called, really the origin of the word gymnosperm is that these are called naked seeds, or as I learned to say it here in the great state of Texas, naked seeds. So, and that just means they're not in a fruit. That's why they're called naked. Okay. And then with angiosperms, we're going to get much more detail with them because, like I said, we have the most interaction with these type of plants as humans. And these are almost, well, for the most part, animal pollinated. There are some flowering plants that use wind pollination. They produce lots more pollen, and really their pollination strategy is very much like gymnosperms. So their flowers are very small. They're not trying to attract a pollinator, and they produce lots and lots of pollen. Okay, so let's talk about this sexual reproduction in angiosperms. So the flower is the reproductive organ of the plant, of the flowering plant. And I always think it's super ironic, and maybe there's something, kind of universally interesting about this, but humans use flowers to, in courtship, like in weddings and at prom and as gifts on Valentine's Day. We use flowers in our courtship rituals. And that's what the plant uses it for, is to reproduce. So I just think it's kind of an interesting thing. So let's talk about the structure of the flower. Now this is a lily, and the thing about some flowers, they have really big reproductive organs. They're huge, they're easy to see. We can see all of these parts and point them out, and it makes it really easy. Now other flowers are much more, they have just as much reproductive success, but they have either smaller reproductive parts or their layout is different because they have aggregate structure. So we're going to look at it on something like this, like a lily, because it's real easy for us to see, because lilies have great big reproductive parts. So we're going to use them. But just know, structures or flowers like sunflowers also have these structures, but the way that you see them is much different because of the layout of the plant. But like I said, we use this one because it's easy to see. All right, so in general, these are the structures of a flower, and we're going to start with the parts of the flower that are actually not the reproductive structure directly. So the first part are the sepals. So you see them labeled here. Both the sepals and petals really are modified leaves, but focusing on the sepals, they're located here. And really their function comes when the flower is developing. So when it is a flower bud, it's protective. So you can see it very clearly in roses. Roses are a great way to see sepals. So these are sepals. And you see them at the base of the flower whenever, after the flower blooms. That's when you kind of see them down here at the bottom. And these are sometimes green, but not always. So for example, here, these are actually stargazer lilies. And these that you are looking at are the sepals. And so they have some coloring to them. They're certainly not green. And when they open up, they're going to kind of look like petals. But they are thicker and they are not as bright. And really the way that you could tell is because when the bud is closed completely, they're on the outside. So that's what sepals do. They're just to protect. The petals exist to attract pollinators. And so that's why we see those, right? And then there are two other structures that are worth knowing. So there's what's called the peduncle, which is a very kind of ugly name, I think. But this is what attaches the flower to the rest of the plant, to the stem. And then there's something, it's actually not labeled in this picture. But I couldn't find a picture that had everything else that I wanted. But it's this here, okay? And it's called the receptacle. All right, so this is the receptacle. It's the widened part at the base of the flower. Okay, the receptacle. And it's what connects the peduncle to the rest of the flower. It's the receptacle. There's one type, as far as I know, there's one type of fruit that's really not a fruit because fruits have seeds on the inside. So can you guys think of any fruits you would call a fruit? Some of you even said it was your favorite fruit, and I love it too, that the seeds are on the outside. Strawberries. Strawberries have seeds on the outside, not on the inside. And that's because a strawberry is a modified receptacle. So what happens is we're going to see later, excuse me, that the seeds are in here. They're going to develop inside of here. And so what happens is in strawberry plants, it's so crazy. If you've ever grown strawberries, they do, you've seen they have white flowers. What happens is that this receptacle grows and the seeds are on the outside. And so that's what you're eating, and I'm eating. Super different than anything else as far as I know. Certainly any popular plant, any popular fruit that I know. So technically, strawberries are not a fruit because you're not actually eating the ovary of the plant, because by definition, the fruit is an ovary. So really, a strawberry is truly a vegetable because you're eating a vegetative or the not reproductive portion of the plant. Now, technically, would the receptacle exist if the flower didn't exist? Probably not, but super interesting, I think. All right, so now let's get into the parts of the flower that are directly reproductive. So I'm using a different picture, but these structures are here as well. I just like this picture because it shows them the male and female parts separately. So here is the male parts, okay? So we'll start with those because there are less of them. And there are two male parts, an anther and a filament. And interestingly, I was talking to my mom about this one, and she said she thought these were seeds. So if you thought these were seeds, these parts here, no, they are not seeds. That is called the anther. And the anther is where pollen is produced. And so pollen is the male gametophyte in flowering plants. And so inside of here are sperm. And then the filament is just this structure that holds up the anther. That's what it does. Holds it up. And it kind of makes sense, like wherever the anther and filament are located within the flower, and like I said, there's a lot of variety in this. They're not always laid out exactly like this. But ultimately, think about the fact that the pollen needs to attach to the pollinator. So wherever the filament is holding the anther, it's that way to allow for pollinators to get that pollen on them. So that's what you see here. These are the filaments. All right, and then the female reproductive structures, here we see on this side. So they're all part of the same flower, okay? Now, there are there are plants that produce male flowers and female flowers, okay? Those are called dioecious plants, and they have these same structures. They're just have flowers that have just the male structures, and then they have other flowers that have the female structures. Most of the time, what I've seen is flowering plants are what's called monoecious. So they produce only one, or they put them together. Both the male and female structures are in the same flower. So that's how we're going to learn it, but just know they can be separate. All right, so one of the things I forgot to say, let me go back real quick, is that, so this is the anther here at the top, and this is the filament. The two together, this structure is called the stamen, which I think I can remember because it says men, and this is the male reproductive structures, okay? So together, those are called the stamen. The stamen's made of the anther and the filament. Okay, in females, the whole female reproductive structure is here, okay? And that is called the pistil, but with the eyes, so pistil. Or I've also seen it many times written as carpel, which, again, I wish it was consistently one or the other, but it's not, so I want you to see both. And the carpel is made up of several structures as well. So starting at the bottom, we have the ovary, which is down here. And in this structure, I think it's nice in this picture, the actually live flower picture down here. So you can kind of see this has been cut open. Inside of there is the, you can kind of see that there's eggs inside of there. So that's the ovary, or and inside it are eggs or ovules. So the structure is called an ovary, and each egg is called, well, ovule I think actually is a synonym for ovary. And then the eggs could be called eggs or ova. And then at the top of the pistil, we have the stigma, and the stigma is sticky. And that's where pollen is going to land and hopefully stick to that stigma. And then this, basically this neck structure in between is called the style. So it's stigma, style, ovary from top to bottom. Okay? All right. So, in plants, in flowering plants, when reproduction is occurring, there's going to be these three main parts. We're going to have pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal, which we actually talked about seed dispersal in a previous video, so we won't really get into that one today. But there is a distinct difference between pollination and fertilization, so let's address that. So pollination occurs when a pollen grain from the same species lands on the stigma. That's pollination. Okay, I love this picture here. This is a it's a computer enhanced microscopic image of this. Here's the stigma, and here is, in this plant, this is a flowering plant called Arabidopsis that's used in genetic research, and it actually has a really thin style. Okay, it's right here. And then this is the ovary, and these are eggs in here. Okay, and so what happens is the pollen grain lands, and it makes a tube, and you can see there's tons of them here. So lots of pollen grains have landed on this stigma, and it makes a tube down. And in angiosperms, this forms there are two sperm cells within the pollen grain that travel, you can see it here, down the style to the ovary, and actually go into the individual eggs to fertilize, which is just crazy cool. Okay, and like I said, I love in this picture that you can actually see this happening. Okay, I included this just so that you understand that what's happening here is this is actually driven by hormones that indicate for the plant, for the pollen in the pollen tube, where the ovary is. So it's not just gravity pulling it down, because this works when the plant's upside down or sideways or whatever. So there's actually a chemical signal that pulls the pollen tube toward the ovary and then allows for the sperm and egg to meet. Now, when that happens, then we have not just pollination, but fertilization, when the egg and the sperm unite. Okay? And so as it says here, we're going to have fertilization. And what happens in angiosperms is they have what's called double fertilization. Sorry, my nose is itchy. Double fertilization. So what happens is there's two sperm that go down here, and one sperm is going to fertilize the egg, and that's going to become the baby plant or the zygote. The other sperm is going to, in meiosis, we talked about how in female organisms they produce the polar bodies, whereas in male organisms they didn't. So that's what this is talking about, kind of. And so it's going to join with that polar nuclei, and it's going to form what's called an endosperm. And that is what's going to provide our food supply for our developing embryo, for our zygote. And so that's something that's unique to angiosperms. Double fertilization. Okay. And then each of our fertilized eggs, I didn't say it, I was right earlier. So each of our fertilized eggs is going to become a seed, and then the surrounding organism or surrounding structure, the ovary, grows into a fruit. And there's lots of different kinds, as you can see over here. Some plants can reproduce asexually, not all of them, but some. And so we know that mitosis is the process where we produce identical cells, and we know the reasons why mitosis might occur. Okay, the first type of asexual reproduction we're going to talk about is through what's called regeneration or fragmentation. And this is basically where the plant is replacing lost body parts. Or, yeah, that's basically what's happening. So what you see here is this is after a fire, and this limb is replacing, it's growing leaves. So this is regeneration. This is happening through mitosis. This is something that humans take advantage of in order to propagate plants. And so that's called propagation. And it's vegetative because we're not using the flower part. And so humans will take cuttings, and not all plants can do this, but some, where we can cut off a part of the plant and it will start to develop roots and shoots. And then another of these processes is what's called grafting. And humans do this a lot with trees. So essentially we cause this damage within our two structures. And then usually it's taped together. And then over time it will heal, right? Which is one of the things that happens because of mitosis. And these structures will unify and be able to carry out the normal functioning of the plant. The other method is through what's called vegetative reproduction. And I actually talked about this a little bit when we talked about stems and roots. But this is, instead of there being an injury or reproducing just a specific structure, it's reproducing a whole plant. This is a strategy that some plants use. Structures grow out. Remember, we talked about them called stolons. In some plants, they grow out and land, and then can start another plant. And so this is genetically identical to that parent plant. But if this were to be severed, these would be independent. Okay. Another example is through rhizomes. This can occur with roots, and this is called a spider plant. My great-grandma always had these, and I thought they were just so weird because each of these little guys can either break off and fall, or if this was on the ground, go onto the ground and then start to make another plant. And so, again, humans take advantage of this, and we, again, call that propagation instead of reproduction. And so sometimes we use pegs that could eventually be removed, or stakes to facilitate this, okay? Because we want those plants to reproduce. So those are some ways that plants reproduce asexually. All right, so miss you guys. There's going to be some changes coming in the next few days, and hopefully I will get to talk to you soon.